Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda. Prabhu Nityananda Gadadha Shivasari Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Krishna Hare, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare hṛdayam, Krishna yadhavaya namaha, Gopal Govindadam Shri Madhusudan, hṛdayam, Krishna yadhavaya namaha, Gopal Govindadam Shri Madhusudan. Jai Nitai Gauranga, Jai Nitai Gauranga, Nitai Gauranga, Gaura Hare, Prabhupada, 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 Jai Prabhupada. Jayam Vishnupad Paramahamsa Purivrajaka Ashtatara Saraswasamansala Abhay Charanara Binda Bhakti Vedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki, ISKCON Pratishthat Acharya Srila Prabhupada ki, Ananta Kodi Vaishnava Vrinda ki, Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Shamaveta Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki, Navadeep Mayapur Dham ki, Shashi Sinitai Gaur Shitanath Pramanande. Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Jidapurakamallam Shri Gurun Vaishnavangscha Shri Rupam Shagarajatam Sahagana Raganatam Vedantang Shajivam Shadvaitam Shavadutam Parijana Shaitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Shahagana Lalita Shivishakang Vidangscha Mantra Guru Ajota Shika Guru Ganta Charane Yage Kari Abandon Banshakapatu Bishtakapa Shandu Vivacha Potitanam Pavaneva Vaishnavagana Monaman Momishnu Parai Krishna Pristai Putale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gaudavani Prachani Nivisheshashanam Prashtata Deshtari Mukam Karti Jalam Bhangam Langa Deginam Chatkapadam Hambande Shri Gunam Dinataninam Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Dharma Prujita Kaitava Atra Paramanian Vatsanam Satam Vinamashma Adrashtu Shivadam Tapatroy Unmulanam Srimad Bhagavate Mahamuni Kite King Vaipara Ishara Sadyaridi Avaruddhite Atra Kiti Bishtakshana. Vaishvanaram jativi hashyagataha. Huh? This is 24. Vaishvanaram. Tada, this is 25. Tada. Tad Vishvanabhim Tvati Bharta Vishnur. Huh? Two, three, two. Yeah, it comes after 23. Whoops. Tadangsha-sharam hṛdayam batedaṁ yad-gṛhyamāṇaiḥ hari-nāma-dheyaiḥ na vikriyetātha yadā vikāro netre jalam gātra-ruheṣu harṣaḥ tadangsha-sharam hṛdayam batedaṁ yad-gṛhyamāṇair hari-nāma-dheyaiḥ na vikriyetātha yadā vikāro netre jalam gātra-ruheṣu harṣaḥ. Please chant. Mothers. tat, that aśma-sāraṁ is steel framed, hṛdayam, heart, bata idam, certainly that, yat, which, gṛhyamāṇaih, in spite of chanting, hari-nāma, the holy name of the Lord, dheyaiḥ, by concentration of the mind, does not, vikriyeta, change, atha, thus, yadā, when, vikāraḥ, reaction, netre, in the eyes, jalam, tears, gātra-ruheṣu, at the pores, harṣaḥ, eruption of ecstasy. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhakti Vedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki. Certainly the heart is still framed, which, in spite of one's chanting the holy name of the Lord, with concentration, does not change when ecstasy takes place. Tears fill the eyes and the hairs stand on end. Purport by Srila Prabhupada, we should note with profit that in the first 3 chapters of the Second Canto, a gradual process of development of devotional service is being presented. In the first chapter, the first step in devotional service for God consciousness by the process of hearing and chanting has been stressed, and a gross conception of the personality of Godhead in His universal form for the beginners is recommended. By such a gross conception of God, through the material manifestations of His energy, one is enabled to spiritualize the mind and the senses and gradually concentrate the mind upon Lord Viṣṇu, the Supreme, who is present as the Supersoul in every heart and everywhere, in every atom of the material universe. The system of pañca-upāsanā, recommending 5 mental attitudes for the common man, is also enacted for this purpose. Namely, the gradual development, worship of the superior that may be in the form of fire, electricity, the sun, the mass of living beings, Lord Shiva, and at last the impersonal Supersoul, the partial representation of Lord Viṣṇu. They are all nicely described in the 2nd chapter. But in the 3rd chapter, development is prescribed after one has actually reached the stage of Viṣṇu worship or pure devotional service. And the mature stage of Viṣṇu worship is suggested herein in relation to the change of heart. There's quite a difference in the mood. There's a mood. 1st canto, 2nd canto. Mood or style or presentation. 1st canto, Shukdev Goswami hasn't actually arrived. Shukdev Goswami, he comes in the beginning of the 2nd canto. 1st canto is rather unique. To begin with, there's a significant amount of Krishna Lila in the 1st canto. Out of the 19 chapters, at least 12, at least 10 to 12 are discussing about Krishna, and Krishna's present and involved in the pastimes, right from the beginning of chapter 7, when Drona is punished. It's at the end of the Battle of Kurukshetra. That's in the Bhagavatam. The Leelas are beginning after the first prelude, introduction, Siddha Goswami. A preliminary answer to the questions of the sages that hearing and chanting, Shrinvatam Shakata Krishna, Punna, Shrabana Kirtana, Ridyanta Ashto, Hi Abhadrani Vidunati, Abhadrani, Ridyanta, the Abhadra, inauspicious things, the dirty things, Prabhupada translates, abhadra, bidunoti, they are cleansed by shrinvatam svakata Krishna, hearing and discussing about Krishna. And then he mentions that evam prashanna manasa, one's mind, that is just that section of verses in the second chapter, First Canto, it's called Divinity and Divine Service. Prabhupada lectured on those verses more than any other verses of Srimad Bhagavatam, verses 6 to 20 of chapter 2, First Canto. There's more than 120 lectures. Verses 6 to 10, 15 verses, more than 120 lectures, Prabhupada lecturing on those verses. Some cantos, there's no lectures at all. Fourth canto, fifth canto, just a few verses. But Prabhupada particularly selected that. It's like a contents page, it's an initial response. Buddhi buddhini karmani shrutabhyani vibhagashaha. There's so many prescribed activities. Buddhi karmani shrutabhyani vibhagashaha. And they have to be studied in their various divisions. Shrotavyani vibhagashaha. So Atashadu, Sutta Goswami, they elected him as the speaker. Atashadu trayat-sharam. Give us the essence, the cream. Trayat-sharam. Samubrita munishaya. Bruhi badraya bhutanam. And then Bruhi, you tell us. Bhadraya bhutanam. Which shall be auspicious for all living beings. Yanatma shuprashidati, by which they can become fully satisfied. What's the essence of all this? There's so many scriptures, there's so many injunctions, going through them all takes such an effort. So just tell us what's the essence. That by understanding all living beings can become auspicious and get the supreme satisfaction of the mind and self. And so in response to that, Sutta Goswami immediately begins explaining that he's explaining that jnana and vairagya, Vasudevi Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prayoga, janatya shubhayadagyam jnanam chayada hoitukam. They come automatically. But actually these topics of jnana and vairagya, these are the topics that are predominantly described in the Vedic literature, jnana and vairagya. And even Bhagavad Gita, there's the Jnana Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga is it's only Bhagavad Gita as it is, which proclaims the Parama Bhachaha, Shruname Paramaha Bhachaha, Manmana Bhavamad Bhakta. But that's at the end of Gita, Krishna is saying, now hear my supreme instruction. But on every page of Bhagavad Gita as it is, Prabhupada is giving the conclusion of Bhagavad Bhakti. And that way the other translations of Bhagavad Gita weren't able to produce Krishna bhaktas, but Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita as it is immediately was producing so many Krishna bhaktas, because Prabhupada presented it in a less confusing way. However, these generally are the conceptions, and if you take a content approach, in other words, all of the content material that's there in the Vedic literature, similarly, it will be difficult to come to the conclusion of Bhagavad Bhakti. Vedeshu dulabam. Vedeshu dulabam. It is difficult to understand Bhagavad Bhakti, Krishna consciousness, just by studying the Vedas. So Sutta Goswami, he's explaining that just by hearing and chanting about Krishna, this is rather revolutionary. Just by hearing and chanting about Krishna, it doesn't depend upon Varnashram Dharma. It doesn't depend upon your position in the society. It doesn't depend upon your performing your prescribed duties and gradually getting purified. It doesn't depend upon that. Naham vipra, nacha narapati, nabi vaishya, na shudro, naham varni, nacha grihapati, jovanashtava kintu purnam, nikala paramananda, punamritad begopi bado, parakamalayo, dasha anudash, naham vipra, I'm not a Brahmin, nacha narapati. Not a naham vipra, nabi vaishya, not a grihasta, not a bata, not shudra, naham varni, not a sannyasi, not grihashtava, not a grihasta, but I'm the seven of the maintainer of the gopis. This is the conclusion of Bhagavad Bhakti. Even when in Prayag, when Mahaprabhu arrived there Mahaprabhu met Rupa and Anupam after their first meeting in Ramkeli, Aj hoite tomanam rup shanaton, dhanna chara toma dhanna fete mormon. Today I'm giving you the names. Aj hoite tomanam rup shanaton. Mahaprabhu initiated Rupa and Sanatan in Ramkeli Gram. And then he encouraged them very quickly, just like the wife with the paramour lover. You do be very, very diligent in your respective duties, and very quickly Krishna will deliver you. So very quickly Rupa Goswami was able to extricate himself. And along with his younger brother Anupam, they traveled to meet Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who they assumed was in Vrindavan. But because of his overwhelming love of Godhead, actually Balabhadra Bhattacharya and Brahman Krishna Das, they took Mahaprabhu out of Vrindavan because he was just becoming thousands and thousands of times more overwhelmed with love of Godhead. They couldn't cope anymore. And eventually he threw himself in the Jamuna, and then we can't manage this anymore. They took him out of Vrindavan. He was only there for 10 days, 12 days. Mahaprabhu had no idea where he was, what was happening, day or night, friend. He had no idea. They just took him out of Vrindavan. And then from Vrindavan, he came back, reached the banks of Maganga. Bancha kalpataro shigauru sundor, janabir bancha, punnakori nirantor. He's always, the Bancha kalpataru, the desire fulfilling Gauchandra, he's always seeking opportunity to fulfill the desires of Maganga. Janabir bancha, punnakori nirantor. He's constantly seeking opportunity to fulfill the desires of Maganga. So again, he came back to the banks of Maganga, Prayagraj, Triveni. You take bath there, Triveni. There's the ashram of Jogi Adityanath. His ashram is there on the bank of Triveni. He's going to be without getting into politics, his ashram, constantly you hear the Bhagavad Gita being chanted. So Mahaprabhu arrived there. It's very extraordinary. Prabhupada begins his teachings of Lord Chaitanya, the book that he introduces Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to the Western world, Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, written in 1968, I believe even before Second Canto, Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. It's a summary of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, like a similar approach to Krishna book. Prabhupada, he completed first canto, the 10th canto. So Prabhupada, let me give the summary of Krishna's pastimes now. The summary, Krishna book, 10th canto. And similarly, Chaitanya Charitamrita, what a vast treatise, ontological Siddhanta, Goswami Siddhanta. The Gaudiya conclusions, Chaitanya Charitamrita, such exalted, such an extraordinary scripture. And what a benediction to humanity Srila Prabhupada has given by translating Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. Is there anyone more qualified? Could you find anyone more qualified than Srila Prabhupada to translate Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita and give it to the world? He's born in the aristocratic Bengali Gaudiya Vaishnava family in the city at the time, which was the jewel of the empire, and received the first class education in English, conversant in all the English poets, Shakespeare. Prabhupada would quote Shakespeare. Valor is the best part of discretion. Prabhupada would quote Shakespeare. That's from Julius Caesar. We hear that one time, and I think Gargamuni Prabhu told that one time Prabhupada told the whole story of the Merchant of Venice in Calcutta. And then such a guru, Sridhanta Saraswati Thakur, and then so qualified Prabhupada's his studies, his philosophical understanding, his sannyas, his world preaching, he did which no one else could do. No one could do, and his godbrothers thought it was just poetic. Every town and village on the planet. That's just poetry. It will be spread here and there. But Prabhupada actually believed it and did it. And you can hear lectures, 1975, Gaur-Purnima, Prabhupada sitting here downstairs. He's speaking, 15 days he was in Mayapur. He spoke on the first 15 verses of Chaitanya Charitamrita. As he's sitting with surrounded by his sannyasi disciples from America, from Germany, from Europe. There's no comparison. What Prabhupada... On the topic we like right now, on the topic we like to seeing we've come to Prabhupada and his extraordinary achievements and his extraordinary disciples, we'd like to pay our respects to Sahadev Prabhu, who left his body yesterday, Prabhupada's disciple. We pay our respects and we congratulate Sahadev Prabhu for achieving the perfection of leaving his body in Navadip Dham, Sri Mayapur, where Prabhupada said, living and dying is the same in Mayapur. You live, you serve Sri Hari. You die, you go to and serve Sri Hari. Sahadev Prabhu was a pujari in Melbourne Mahaprabhu Mandir in the 1970s. Prabhupada came and said, I'm leaving you, Radha Ballabh, and I'm leaving you in the hands of the Malecha Jaban class. And he initiated them, and they were worshipping Radha Ballabh, Gaunitai Prabhupada, Mahaprabhu, Melbourne Mahaprabhu Mandir. He was a pujari there. I lived just a few blocks away, but I never went in the 70s. But I went in the 80s. So I have a debt to Sahadev Prabhu for his sacrifice in establishing Krishna consciousness in Melbourne. And subsequently I was able to come to Krishna consciousness as a result of the sacrifices that the devotees, Prabhupada's disciples in the 1970s made. They were put in jail, they were persecuted, they were shot at, they were imprisoned. Korma Prabhu went on the hunger fast in the jail because they were chanting on the streets. So we offer our respects to Sahadev Prabhu. We congratulate him for achieving the perfection of leaving the body in Mayapur, and we pray that he quickly attains the shelter of Lotus feet of Srila Prabhupada and Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Sahadev Prabhu ki. Just read a little more of the report, huh? So anyway, we were in Allahabad and Prayag. Anupam and Rupa, they came. At that time, Vallabhacharya, the great Brahman Vaishnav, Vallabhacharya, the Acharya of the Pushti Marg, Vallabha Sampradaya. And when Rupa and Sanatan, they saw Vallabhacharya, they were going in the other direction, going away. And Mahaprabhu said, oh, don't go close to them. Don't go close to them. They're rejected from the Brahminical society. He was testing Vallabhacharya. And Rupa and Anupam, they're in the distance, they're on the ground, they're chanting, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare hari-nāma-dheyaiḥ, hari-nāma. Feeling humility and not approaching Vallabhacharya. And Vallabhacharya said, no, it's not possible they can be impure, from whose lips the holy name is constantly chanted. And he quoted from Devahuti, Upadesh, Third Canto Bhagavatam. Aho bata shvapacho to gariyak jivagre bhatata namatubhyam. How glorious! Aho! Swapacha, even those born in the family of dog eaters. Yet jiva agre vatite namatubhyam, if they take your name. Jiva agre, just a little bit of chanting. Agre, just the beginning of chanting. Jiva vatit namatubhyam te pustapaste juhuvu shashnu aryo. They performed all the austerities, traveled to all the places of pilgrimage, bathed in all the holy places. Brahmanachur, studied all the Vedas. Brahmanachur, namagrinanti yete, just by chanting your name. The conclusions of Srimad Bhagavatam, hearing and chanting, is the eligibility for every being, every human being, take to hearing and chanting. And then very quickly, evam prasanna manasya bhagavad bhakti jogataha. By engagement, full engagement in the hearing and chanting process is called the Bhagavat Marg, hearing and chanting. Evam prasanna manasya bhagavad bhakti jogataha, bhagavad bhakti jogataha. By contacting the Supreme Lord through devotional service, Bhagavat tattva vijnanam. Bhagavat tattva vijnanam. You realize God just by the process of hearing and chanting. That's the second chapter of the Bhagavatam, is coming to the ultimate conclusion. Just by hearing and chanting, you realize God. Mukta sanjaya jayate, and we become completely liberated. And just by hearing and chanting process. So the Bhagavatam, Prabhupada explains that Vyasa Muni, he compiled Srimad Bhagavatam in his maturity. In the introduction, Prabhupada explains, Vyasa Muni compiled Srimad Bhagavatam in his maturity. That means he evolved. After compiling all of the Vedic literature, Upanishads, Vedanta Sutra, and Itihash, Mahabharata, wherein Bhagavad Gita is also found. But still he wasn't satisfied. And therefore Narayana Muni came Aho Mahabhaga, Oh, greatly fortunate, oh Mahabhaga, Bhavan Amogadrik, your vision is clear. Suchi Shrava Satya Ratul Jidabrada, you're fixed in the vows, you're pure. Urukama Shakla Bandhu Muktaye, Shamadina Anushmara, Tadbichestitam. Meditate on the variety of pastimes of Urukama. By describing them, just by hearing those pastimes, everyone can be Bandhu Muktaye, completely liberated from bondage, the Srimad Bhagavatam, the order of Narad Muni to Vyas, to compile Srimad Bhagavatam, which he compiled in his maturity. And coming to this conclusions, the Bhagavat Siddhanto, just by hearing and chanting, just by Bhagavad Bhakti, Shravanam Kirtanam Viṣṇu Smaranam. It's completely transcendental. So the Bhagavatam, the first canto opens, it's first canto of the Bhagavatam, immediately. We're getting straight to the point. Om Namo Bhagavate Vāsudevāya. Prabhupada's commenting that so as to no more confusion. Not having to sift through volumes and volumes of Vedic literatures and Puranas and Vedanta Sutra. Murka tumi, tomar nahika Vedanta adhikar. You're a fool, Ishwarpuri exclaimed to Mahaprabhu. Murka tumi, tomar nahika Vedanta adhikar. Krishna nama japa shara e mantra shara. No need to study the Vedanta, just chant the holy name of Krishna. So the first canto, and immediately, and then after explaining the Srimad Bhagavatam, he mentions idam Bhagavatam nama, he mentions the Bhagavatam, Sutta Goswami. Krishna svadam upagate, Krishna has returned to his own abode, dharma jnana adibishaha, with religion and knowledge, kalo nashtadrisham esha. Those who are remaining in the Kali Yuga, whose nashtadrisham, whose vision is destroyed, as a result of influence of Kali Yuga, Puranako Odunuditaha, will get light from this Purana. So then in the fourth chapter of the first canto, Shonak Rishi again inquires. It seems that they were already aware of the Bhagavatam and its author. Even though Sutta Goswami was alluding to the Bhagavatam and the process of hearing and chanting, he mentions. And then they inquired, well, how that he doesn't particularly mention Vyasadeva. Shonak Rishi knew the Bhagavatam was compiled by, but he inquires from where did Vyasadeva get the inspiration to compile Srimad Bhagavatam, even though he had already undergone such an effort. How was it that he became further inspired? Chapters 4 to 6 of the first canto explain how Narad Muni came. Corrected Vyas. What to speak of us? We may have been devotees for decades. But that doesn't mean that we don't require correction. Everyone requires correction. Yes, thank you. Confirms. Everyone requires correction. But that's the problem, that it's so easy to become senior in ISKCON. So easy. There's so many new people joining. You just have to be around. All of a sudden you become senior. Just have to hang around, become senior. And then that's it, we're no longer inclined to take correction. But there's a few kind souls that are still they're merciful and correct us. But even Vyas Muni required correction. The Shakta Abheshavata, everyone requires correction. So he was corrected by Narad, became inspired, compiled Srimad Bhagavatam. And then they also asked, how was it that Parikshit and Shukdev Goswami happened to come together on the banks of Ma Ganga? And Shukdev Goswami will narrate these glorious 12 cantos of Srimad Bhagavatam. How did that situation eventuate? So in answering that question, chapters 8 to 19 of Canto 1 are explaining how Shukdev Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj came together on the bank of the Ganga. Beginning with the conclusion of the Battle of Kurukshetra, Kunti's prayers, Krishna remains a few more months in Hastinapura, even though he'd completed his duties, completing the Battle of Kurukshetra, he remains a few more months. They go and see Bhishma Dev's departure, and then Krishna, he returns to Dwarka, chapter 10. He leaves Hastinapura, chapter 10, arrives in Dwarka, chapter 11. Birth of Parikshit, chapter 12. They also asked specifically about the birth of Parikshit. Shonak Rishi asked. And then the departure of Krishna, the departure of the Pandavas, Parikshit being installed, Parikshit touring, meeting Kali Yuga, the interaction, Parikshit being cursed by Shringi, or his son, and accepting that curse, seeing as an opportunity to free himself from the diversion his life had taken in family life and in politics, etc. Of course, his Pandavas, they're eternal associates of the Lord. They appear with him time and time again. In Gaur-lila, they appeared as the sons of what's his name? Ramananda Roy's father? Bhavananda Roy. Yeah. They appeared there. The 5 Pandavas were there in Gaur-lila. So it wasn't really in Maya, but Srimad Bhagavatam had to be given, had to be spoken. So in this Leela, in this circumstance, the opportunity for Srimad Bhagavatam to be spoken was spoken. So the first canto is very unique. And what's more, Shukha Mukadamrita Drabya Samyuta is more sweet because it pecked the shukha, just like the mangoes. Oh, for season. Oh, that's summer season. When will it come? As I'm putting on layers and layers of chadors and clothes, I'm just thinking, oh, the summer is just one cloth. You can't even put a t-shirt on. In May, you can't even put a t-shirt on. It's too hot. It's mango season. Lichu. Bhagavane kripai hobe. So the mango becomes sweeter when it's pecked by the parrot. Shushuka mukha. Coming from the lips of Shukadev goes Shuka mukha amrita drabya samyuta, becomes sweeter, become tasted, relished by the lips of Sri Shukadev Goswami. For us, it's even sweeter coming through the lips of Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada ki. Prabhupada's purports to the Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada's purports to the Srimad Bhagavatam. His masterpiece of his literary contributions. Purports of Srimad Bhagavatam. And what's even more extraordinary about the first canto is that it was written even before ISKCON existed. I have that mood when I'm fortunate to visit Sri Vrindavan Dham and Radha Damodar Mandir, and you go in Prabhupada's room there, Prabhupada there, it's a special mood there because there's no secretaries, there's even no GBC, no ISKCON authorities. The Prabhupada says he's just a sadhu there, being hosted by the Brajabasis. So anyone can go anytime. You don't have to make an appointment with the secretaries. No, Prabhupada's in the mood there. He's just a simple sadhu, absorbed in Srimad Bhagavatam, taking darshan of Rupa Goswami Prabhupada, writing. But everything is there. That's what's most astonishing. To the first canto, you can't believe that ISKCON is not existing when Prabhupada's writing the first canto. Everything is there in his heart. How the holy name will be spread all over the world and there will be a revolution. A Sankirtan revolution, Mahaprabhu's movement. He's predicted, Prabhupada he knew that it would happen. He's writing the book already, and he's just one simple sadhu in Vrindavan. That's extraordinary. And the purports in the first canto, they're so extraordinary. Prabhupada's just giving everything, the vision, the blueprint, the manifesto of the world Sankirtan movement and how Mahaprabhu's Sankirtan movement will spread all over the whole world. So then, when we reach the second canto, it becomes very philosophical. Second canto is very philosophical, and Prabhupada's purports, pages and pages. In fact, this is a long purport. Apologies, we haven't read it yet, but as far as I understand, as long as it's about Krishna in the Srimad Bhagavatam class, there's no real rules. Right? We haven't got a lesson plan or anything. It's just, I prepared for the previous chapter, actually, so it's 50 verses away. So we've got to make something of it today. So the second canto, and so philosophical. And then I was thinking about, the universal form, and the stacks of the mountains are his bones, and the rivers are his veins, and the trees are the hairs, and universal form. And then the yogis going to Shushumna and the Brahmaloka, and in the second canto. Why? Why am I not just carrying on with hearing and chanting about Krishna? It's something that we can think about and consider. Yajmin prati shlokam abhadavatapi namani anantasya jashan kintani. Narad explains that each and every syllable, namani anantasya jashan kintani, is glorifying his name, his qualities, his pastimes. Tadbhag tadbhag bishagar janataga biplava. Each and every syllable can create a revolution, each and every syllable. And I reflect on, well, Prabhupada wrote the book, The Easy Journey to Other Planets. You've read that book? It was written in the 1950s. A little bit different style. Prabhupada's Easy Journey to Other Planets. It was the first book I read. And I carried it with me for some, and I was reading it, but I couldn't understand anything. I couldn't understand. All I could remember was the material and anti-material worlds. That's all I could understand from that book. But Prabhupada wrote the book, and even there's a picture on the front, the yogi going to the different planets. So these topics are discussed, and even hearing about these topics brings one to Krishna consciousness. And of course, with Prabhupada's purports, then everything is hearing and chanting about Krishna and remembering Krishna. The whole process of spiritual culture is aimed at changing the heart of the living being in the matter of his eternal relation with the Supreme Lord as subordinate servant, which is his eternal constitutional position. So with the progress of devotional service, the reaction of change in the heart is exhibited by gradual detachment from the sense of material enjoyment, by a false sense of lording it over the world, and an increase in the attitude of rendering loving service to the Lord. Vaidhi bhakti, or regulated devotional service by the limbs of the body, is a good definition of Vaidhi bhakti. Regulated devotional service by the limbs of the body. Namely the eyes, the ears, the nose, the hands, and the legs, are already explained herein before. Shravane mone, Shravane varane mone, Shabendriya gone, Krishna bhakti bine nahe bole nahe shune, Vishnu Rup is described. Shravane, hearing, Vadane, speaking, Mone, thinking, Shabendriya gone, with all of his senses. Krishna bhakti bine nahe shune nahe bole. He's not hearing anything, not touching anything, not doing anything, apart from pleasing Krishna with his senses. This is Ananda Bhakti, Shuddha Bhakti. Can also be practiced on the Vaidhi platform by following the rules and regulations given by the Guru and Scripture. Practice of Uttam Bhakti on the Vaidhi platform. Is expected by all means that by discharging regulated devotional service, one must manifest the change of heart. If there is no change, if no such change, the heart must be considered steel-framed, for if not melted, even when there is chanting of the holy name of the Lord. We must always remember that hearing and chanting are the basic principles of discharging devotional service, and if they are properly performed, they will follow the reactional ecstasy with signs of tears in the eyes and standing of hairs on the body. Kirtan korite prabhu, shaba bhabu doi, shtamba, kampa, pulakashu, gadgada pralai. Talk about the melting and the change of the heart as described in Shantipur. Kirtan korite prabhu. When he would hear the kirtan, Prabhu, Mahaprabhu. Kirtan korite, when he would hear the kirtan, sharva bhava udoi. All of the emotions would immediately erupt in his body. Kampa, shtamba, pulakashu. Kampa, quivering, stamba, he became like a column. Just like a column. Stamba. Kampa, stamba, pulakashru, his hair was erupting with palpitations like a jackfruit. Oh, here we go again. Mangoes and jackfruit. His body would pulp like a jackfruit. Pulaka, gadgada, pralai, gadgada, choking of the throat, and pralai, devastation. Devastation in the kirtan. What's the symptoms of devastation? Not exactly sure, but Mahaprabhu manifested devastation. As soon as he would hear the kirtan, if they are properly performed, they will follow the reactional ecstasy with signs of tears in the eyes and standing of hairs on the body. These are natural consequences and are the preliminary symptoms of bhava stage, which occurs before one reaches the perfectional stage of prema, a love of Godhead. If the reaction does not take place, even after continuous hearing and chanting of the holy name of the Lord, it may be considered to be due to offenses only. That is the opinion of the Sandarbha. In the beginning of chanting the holy name of the Lord, if the devotee has not been very careful about evading the 10 kinds of offenses at the feet of the holy name, certainly the reactions of feelings of separation will not be visible by tears in the eyes and standing of hair on end. The bhava stage is manifested by 8 transcendental symptoms, namely inertness, perspiration, standing of the hairs on end, failing in the voice, trembling, paleness of body, tears in the eyes, and finally trance. The Nectar of Devotion, a summary study of Srila Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, explains those symptoms and vividly describes other transcendental developments, both in steady and accelerating manifestations. As Nectar of Devotion. Actually, it should be studied. The fashion in ISKCON, which has been done for many decades, the Bhakti Shastri course includes the first 19 chapters of Bhakti Rasamrita, Nectar of Devotion, and then it stops. That's the world international standard of Bhakti Shastri in my book. But actually, Prabhupada said in the Nectar of Devotion, he said the whole book at Bhakti Shastri level. So anyway, we're trying to see if we can include the remaining sections of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, of the Nectar of Devotion, and Bhakti Vaibhav, Bhakti Vedanta, Bhakti Sarvabhauma. Bhakti Sarvabhauma would be so sweet because Mahaprabhu, you could do the project on where the Mahaprabhu and his associates are demonstrating the symptoms that Srila Rupa Goswami is describing in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. And also all the other examples from the Bhagavatam that Rupa Goswami is giving of the, that's examples of the accelerated, Prabhupada, I lost the spot. Accelerated and steady and accelerating manifestations of bhava and prema. Srila Viṣṇu Chakravarti Thakur has critically discussed all these bhava displays in connection with some unscrupulous neophytes imitating the above symptoms for cheap appreciation. Not only Viṣṇu Chakravarti, but also Srila Rupa Goswami treated them very critically. Sometimes all the above 8 symptoms of ecstasy are imitated by the mundane devotees, prakrita sahajiyas. And the Shuddha symptoms are at once detected when one sees the Shuddha devotees addicted to so many forbidden things. Even in Navadip you will find such organizations, and you can hire them and they will perform ecstatic kirtan and cry with tears of love of God. You hire them for a program. Yeah. Navadip. And then afterwards they take off their sannyas dress and they just hang out with everyone else and just like normal. Seen that sometimes these symptoms are willfully imitated, and for this reason Srila Viṣṇu Chakravarti accuses the imitators of being stone-hearted men. They must be. The real manifestations are not happening. Well, one time I asked Srila Jayapataka Swami Maharaj, is it okay for devotees to roll on the ground in the kirtan? Because it's mentioned so much. Rolling on a gada when Mahaprabhu, and that's what I was saying about teachings of Lord Chaitanya. The Prabhupada opens that book. He's introducing Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He doesn't begin with, even though the life story of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he doesn't begin with Adi Leela. He begins with Mahaprabhu dancing in ecstasy in Prayag, and tens of thousands of people had gathered, and they're crying, they're rolling on the ground. They're rolling on the ground. There's a picture there, and people rolling on the ground as Mahaprabhu was performing kirtan in Prayag, going to Bindu Madhav temple, and freely distributing. And Kaviraj Goswami describes that although Prayag never floods, even though it's a Triveni, Shangam, Saraswati, Jamuna, Maganga, it never floods, but it was flooded with love of Godhead. Mahaprabhu freely distributing love of Godhead to all the residents of Prayag. And that scene, and then Rupa and Anupama looking at the distance as this is being described. That's the opening scene of the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. That's very extraordinary. Prabhupada, he selected that particular vision to introduce Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to the Western world. He didn't begin in the beginning of Chaitanya Charitamrita. He didn't begin in the beginning of Madhya Lila. He didn't even begin in the beginning of chapter 19. In the middle of chapter 19, he begins that. Well, obviously, it's not a random decision. Prabhupada wanted to introduce this particular Mahabharanaya avatar, who's freely distributing. Patra apatra bicha nahe, naheshnan ashtan, jay jahapai, taha kore premdan, patra apatra. The pot, patra apatra. Apatra is the pot in the bathroom. And the patra, that's the pot in the deity room, although they're both pots. You have to be able to discriminate between the two. But Kaviraj Goswami says that in the distribution of love of Godhead, patra apatra bicha nahe, they don't discriminate who's qualified and who's not. Jai jahapai taha kore prem dhan. Whoever randomly he's giving freely. And this particular aspect of Mahaprabhu's avatar, Gauda avatar, Mahabharanaya avatar, Prabhupada presents this vision to the Western world as the opening presentation of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Prabhupada ki jai. Srila Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur. They're sometimes even affected by the reflection of transcendental symptoms. Yet if they still do not give up the forbidden habits, then they are hopeless cases for transcendental realization. When Lord Chaitanya met Ramananda Roy of Kavod on the banks of the Godavari, the Lord developed all these symptoms when they were embracing. But because of the presence of some non-devotee Brahmins who were attendants of the Rai, the Lord suppressed these symptoms. Sometimes they are not visible even in the body of first-class devotees for certain circumstantial reasons. Yeah. So I asked Javataka Maharaj, can devotees roll on the ground in the kirtan? And he said, well, generally, he said that generally we restrain our ecstasy. He's kind of joking with me, you know. Restrain your ecstasy. He was joking. Generally, we restrain our ecstasy. And he said, but if it comes to a point where you cannot control yourself to roll on the ground, that's what you can roll on the ground when you don't even know that you're rolling on the ground. If you're so overwhelmed, okay. But if you're thinking, make a decision, now I'll roll on the ground. No. We decide not to do that in public. Therefore, real steady bhava is definitely displayed in the matter of cessation of material desires. And now Prabhupada lists these bhava, bhakti, lokhan, as described in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Cessation of material desires, shanti, utilization of every moment in transcendental loving service of the Lord, abhyartha kalatvam, eagerness of glorifying the Lord constantly, nama gane shadaruchi, attraction for living in the land of the Lord, pratishtad bhashatishtale, complete detachment from material happiness, virakti, pridelessness, mana shunyata. One who's developed all these transcendental qualities is really possessed of the bhava stage, as distinguished from the stone-hearted imitator or the mundane devotee. The whole process can be summarized as follows. The advanced devotee who chants the holy name of the Lord in a perfectly offenseless manner and is friendly to everyone can actually relish the transcendental taste of glorifying the Lord. And the result of such realization is reflected in the cessation of all material desires, as mentioned above. The neophytes, due to their being in the lower stage of devotional service, are invariably envious, so much so that they invent their own ways and means of devotional regulations without following the acharyas. As such, even if they make a show of constantly chanting the holy name of the Lord, they cannot relish the transcendental taste of the holy name. Therefore, the show of tears in the eyes, trembling, perspiration, or unconsciousness is condemned. They can, however, get in touch with the pure devotee of the Lord and rectify their bad habits. Otherwise, they shall continue to be stone-hearted and unfit for any treatment. A complete progressive march on the return path home back to Godhead will depend on the instructions of the revealed scriptures directed by a realized devotee. I've been requested to read text 25 too. O Sutta Goswami, your words are pleasing to our minds. Please therefore explain this to us as it was spoken by the great devotee Shukdev Goswami, who is very expert in transcendental knowledge and who spoke to Maharaj Parikshit upon being asked. Purport: knowledge explained by the previous acharyas like Shukdev Goswami and followed by the next like Shuddha Goswami is always powerful transcendental knowledge, is therefore penetrating and useful to all submissive students. Thus end Bhaktivedanta purports of Second Canto, 3rd chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam entitled Pure Devotional Service, Change in the Heart, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Are there any questions? Yes.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. I had a question before reading the purport about hearing. About hearing, the way we hear. Yeah, it should automatically cleanse the heart from contamination. One may be regularly hearing, but I learned that offenses may actually be an obstacle in.
Saying that everyone's like a mass eviction of the class will be brief.
Okay, so
my understanding, hearing is just a hearing. Etat shrutam patata ekagreta chetasaha. Have you heard this with attention? It just means hearing, sitting and hearing. That's it. That's offenseless. Offensive would be that you're selling hearing to make money. Like you're having some program, someone is speaking Bhagavatam, you're charging people, you're making money. That's offensive. That's offensive hearing. But if you don't have to do anything else except sit there and hear. That's it. Shravanadi shuddha chitte karayo udoy. You just sit there and the sound goes in your ears. You just have to oral reception. That's it. Srimad Bhagavatam ki.
Thank you so much.
Gopamānande.